When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often wander to knights in shining armor, towering castles, bustling markets, and grimy taverns. But beneath the pageantry and the plagues, medieval society had some surprisingly strict and often bizarre rules. What was considered illegal in those times might leave you scratching your head today. From laws about bread size to bans on certain colors of clothing, medieval law was less about modern ideas of justice and more about control, order, and a deeply entwined relationship between church, crown, and community. You wouldn't believe what could land you in stocks, or worse. Let's start with something as simple as clothing. In medieval Europe, what you wore wasn't just a matter of fashion. It was a declaration of your social rank. Sumptuary laws were created to prevent people from dressing above their station. If you were a peasant, you couldn't wear silk. If you were a merchant, you couldn't don fur, like the nobility. Colors were restricted too. Purple and gold were often reserved for royalty and the church. Violating these dress codes could result in fines, public shaming, or confiscation of garments. Imagine getting arrested just for looking too fancy at church. Food, too, was closely monitored. Bakers, for instance, were watched with an eagle eye. In many cities, there were strict regulations on the weight and price of bread. The size of bread and ale, a law in England dating back to the 13th century, dictated exactly how much a loaf should weigh and how much it should cost depending on grain prices. If a baker shorted you even slightly, the punishment could be brutal, ranging from a fine to public humiliation in the pillory, or being dragged through the streets with a loaf tied around your neck. Bread was serious business. Speaking of food, you could also get in trouble for eating the wrong thing at the wrong time. The church ruled life in the Middle Ages, and that included your diet. On certain days of the week, and during periods like Lent, eating meat was strictly forbidden. It wasn't just a matter of piety, it was law. Butchers could be punished for selling meat on prohibited days, and people caught eating it could face church discipline or fines. It's hard to imagine a world where eating a sausage on Friday could get you punished. But that was the reality for much of medieval Christendom. Entertainment wasn't always safe either. In some places, dancing was banned or restricted, especially in churches or on holy days. The church viewed many types of music and dancing as immoral and disruptive. There were even times when carol singing, yes, singing Christmas carols, was outlawed for being too rowdy or associated with drunken behavior. In fact, almost any gathering that looked like it might lead to revelry could be labeled as disorderly and illegal. So much for letting loose after a long day of labor. Then there were laws about morality that went far beyond what we consider private life today. Adultery was illegal. So was fornication. People caught engaging in sexual acts outside of marriage could be fined, whipped, or even imprisoned. Prostitutes were tolerated in many towns, but only within specific areas. Outside those zones, both the women and their clients could face serious penalties, and public shaming was common. Imagine being paraded through town with signs hanging from your neck declaring your crimes. That was real medieval justice. Even personal hygiene wasn't off the radar. Believe it or not, bathing was frowned upon in some periods. Public bathhouses became associated with sin and immorality, especially during outbreaks of disease. Some religious authorities even declared that excessive cleanliness was a form of vanity. While not outright illegal in most cases, frequent bathing could certainly raise eyebrows or mark you as someone of suspicious morals. Religious belief, of course, was the most tightly controlled aspect of medieval life. Heresy wasn't just wrong, it was criminal. Speaking out against the church's teachings, owning the wrong texts, or even discussing religious ideas without approval could result in harsh punishment. Inquisitions were real, and heretics could be excommunicated, imprisoned, or executed. Some were burned alive. It wasn't only religious leaders enforcing these rules. Secular authorities often worked hand in hand with the church to maintain religious orthodoxy. You also wouldn't believe how animals could be part of the legal system. In some parts of medieval Europe, animals were put on trial for crimes. Pigs, dogs, even insects could be brought before a court. There are actual records of pigs being tried for murder, some even executed. These weren't symbolic acts either. Entire legal procedures were carried out, complete with witnesses, judges, and punishments. To the medieval mind, law and order extended to all living creatures. On the more ridiculous side of the legal spectrum, it was sometimes illegal to be idle. Towns and cities had vagrancy laws to punish people who weren't working or didn't appear to have a purpose. The fear of wandering beggars and unemployed peasants was so strong that many places required citizens to have a known trade or craft. If you couldn't prove that you had a job or a home, you could be arrested. The idea of just taking a break was not something society tolerated well. One law that particularly stands out comes from 14th century England, where it became illegal to play certain sports. Why? Because young men were spending too much time playing football and not enough time practicing archery. Archery was essential for military defense, so the king banned other sports to keep men focused on their longbows. Picture being arrested not for fighting or stealing, but for playing a game with your friends. That was the world medieval folks lived in. You also couldn't just leave town without permission. Travel was tightly regulated in many areas. Serfs needed the lord's approval to leave the manor. Merchants often required licenses or travel permits to cross certain territories. Roads were dangerous, and authorities wanted to keep tabs on who was moving where. Freedom of movement, something we take for granted today, simply didn't exist for much of the population. Even laughter had its limits. Satire and jokes that targeted the nobility or the church could be seen as treason or blasphemy. Wandering minstrels, jesters, and playwrights had to tread carefully. What started as a funny story could end with a trip to the gallows if the wrong person took offense. Words were powerful and dangerous. If all this sounds overwhelming, that's because it was. Life in the Middle Ages was lived under a constant web of rules, many of them bizarre, some terrifying. The law was everywhere, and it was enforced not just by kings and knights, but by townsfolk, clergy, guilds, and neighbors. Public punishment was designed to make examples of people. Stocks, pillories, flogging, and even mutilation weren't just tools of justice, they were spectacles. Justice wasn't just served, it was paraded through the streets. So the next time you complain about a parking ticket or a long line at the DMV, remember this. At least you're not getting whipped for wearing velvet or singing the wrong song on Sunday. The Middle Ages were filled with wonder and horror, beauty and brutality. But when it came to the law, it was often less about fairness and more about fear, control, and keeping people in their place. It's both fascinating and chilling to realize how much our modern world has changed, and how many freedoms we enjoy today that were once unimaginable. Reading about these old laws gives us a window into a society that was, at its core, trying to survive through structure, even if that structure was rigid and sometimes absurd. It's a reminder that progress, though slow and messy, is something to be deeply grateful for. And maybe, just maybe, it'll make you appreciate your next loaf of bread a little more. If the laws of the Middle Ages left you speechless, you're not alone. It's almost hard to believe that wearing the wrong color, singing too loud, or even playing football could land you in serious trouble. But that was the strange and often terrifying world of medieval justice, a place where control ruled over fairness, and fear kept society in check. Looking back at these bizarre rules reminds us just how far we've come, and how lucky we are to live in a time where freedom of thought, expression, and movement is a given, not a gamble. So the next time you put on your favorite outfit or eat what you want when you want, take a moment to appreciate the freedom behind those simple choices, because not too long ago, they could have made you a criminal. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the strange laws of the past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There are so many more unbelievable stories from history waiting to be uncovered, and we'd love to explore them with you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious, question everything, and remember the past was a weird place.